Today I'm going to talk about the Melvins' second record, Ozma, and my part in the creation of that. I was the producer of that record, and I'm going to talk a little bit about behind the scenes and how I ended up doing the record. So we had done Gluey Porch Treatments in 1986 for my label, Alchemy Records. Melvins still had Matt Lukin in the band at the time, who played on Gluey Porch Treatments and a couple of other things previous to that. He was the original bass player from Aberdeen, Washington, also like Buzz and Dale. In 1986, I produced Gluey Porch Treatments, the first record for the Melvins. And that was a really cool record. Got great critical response. Lots of people liked it. And it was an extremely influential record. And so in 1986, they went on their way touring whatever they were doing. And by that time, Lori Black and I, who had been a couple since about 1979, 1980, had relocated to San Francisco after living in Los Angeles until 1983. So we lived in San Francisco from 1983 to 1988. And during that time, I did the Gluey Porch Treatments album for the Melvins for my label, Alchemy Records. Lori and I were still a couple, and our relationship had become somewhat rocky at that point, but we were still together. We still had the band Clown Alley, and we were still trying to make that be successful on our own terms. In 1987, I believe, Buzz came down to visit San Francisco, and I think he came down twice in that year. And it became kind of evident that he and Lori were kind of getting together and having some feelings for each other. I observed this pretty closely as Lori and I were still living in the house together in San Francisco. And then Buzz went back to Aberdeen and was living up there and trying to get Dale and Matt Lukin to relocate to San Francisco. And I was kind of aware of these things because Lori was talking to me about them. And I was going, yeah, well, this will be a cool thing if they want to move down here. It will obviously be something better for the band if they can have a larger city as a base to work out of. So once it became really evident that Lori and Buzz were going to get together, I told Lori that I thought it was time for us to basically split up. She was very sad about this and really kind of wanted things to go on as usual with the addition of the Melvins living with us, which I just couldn't see how that was going to work out at all. So I just said, nope, I'm going to think about some other stuff to do. Namely, live some other place, make different plans in life or whatever. So that's exactly what I did. And it got to a point where Buzz had made sort of a plan to move to San Francisco in about a year. And Lori told me about this and I went, okay, so I basically have a year to figure out where I'm going to go, what I'm going to do, et cetera, et cetera. And a few months after Lori told me this information, she then told me that Buzz had changed his mind and that he really needed to get out of Aberdeen for whatever reasons. I wasn't really privy to those. But she said, okay, he's going to be moving down now in 6 months. So to me, that was kind of a shock because I'd started to make plans on basically having a year's worth of time to figure out what I was going to do. Now all of a sudden that time was cut in half. So fast forward a little bit to 1988, and Buzz is going to be moving down to San Francisco in a few months, and I'm kind of in a panic figuring out what I'm going to do. Also happening at this time was my record label basically failing because Victor Hayden kind of went crazy. I talked about that in another video that you might want to take a look at to get the inside story on that. So I decided to move to London. I am a British citizen for people who don't know that. So that was a place that was far enough away and alien enough for me to be able to just have a completely brand new start, basically just after a plane flight. I had a cousin there that I could live with that would let me live with him for a little while I figured out what I was going to do exactly. Buzz moved down to San Francisco. I relocated to London, or just outside of London, and kind of went about rebuilding my life there, starting from zero. I didn't really know any people there. I think I knew one audio engineer who'd worked on a raw power record with me. I knew John Loder, who was the owner of Southern Records, which was the distribution company for Alchemy. I really didn't know anybody else. And I got a job, just went about continuing my new life there. And kind of lost contact with the Melvins, didn't really keep in touch, but Lori Black and I remained friends. And about halfway through 1989, I think, Buzz called me up and said, hey, we're going to be making a new record and we'd like you to produce it. You should come over to San Francisco and do it. You can stay at the house. It was the house that Lori owned and lived in with Buzz. I'm not sure if Dale had moved down there by that point. I think maybe he had. And so I said, well, I'll think about it. And I did some thinking about it. And it was kind of the first sort of real test of friendship. It's like this situation had kind of drifted a little bit into a Fleetwood Mac-y type of scenario where people were just kind of having involved relationships within the band, and that was kind of challenging to the band on a few different levels. But I had just kind of dialed myself out, and I was pretty surprised by this phone call. But on the other hand, not really surprised, because Gluey Porch Treatments had been a really great experience. The record had come out and done pretty well. Critically, it had done very well. And so it seemed logical that they would want to continue making records. They were still a band. And also by this time, Lori had actually joined the Melvins, because I think Buzz and Dale both wanted Matt to move down to San Francisco, and Matt didn't want to leave the Northwest. He didn't want to leave Aberdeen. I think he was still living there at the time and gave them a flat no. So they didn't have a bass player. Buzz and Dale knew of Clown Alley. They had seen Clown Alley. We'd played shows with the Melvins. And so it seemed like sort of a logical move for Lori to become the bass player of the Melvins at the time, which she did. And of course went on to play on Bullhead and Eggnog and a variety of other things and do a few tours with them. So anyway, I thought about this and I thought, well, we really didn't end on any kind of note of bitterness. So Lori and I were still friends after all of this stuff happened, and I was still processing our breaking up. We had been together for quite a long time and been through a lot of stuff that a lot of people don't really know about. I'm not going to go into it here. But we actually reached the point where her mother was really kind of adamant about us getting married and was very sort of encouraging that idea. And Lori and I were both really against the idea. We were too cool to get married, and we were also just going, how would things change if we got married? Of course, we just couldn't really get our heads thinking beyond the institution of just marriage being not very interesting for us or anything that we wanted to pursue. In 1988, I was 29 years old and Lori was 34. So we were not exactly spring chickens, but we had an idea that we did not want to get married, so we didn't get married. At any rate, our relationship had been through a lot, and we kind of mutually decided that, yes, we were going to move in different directions. Lori was going to move in a direction towards a relationship with Buzz, and I was going to move into the absolute unknown, which is exactly what I did. So I was very surprised to get this phone call from Buzz. Once again, we had not ended on a note of bitterness or any kind of acrimony. We just simply headed into different directions. And the experience of Gluey Porch Treatments must have been on their mind when they wanted to make a new record, because they thought of me, and that worked out really well. So I got the phone call about making the new record. They had a new record label, Boner, run by Tom Flynn, who I think was in the band Fang. I'm not really sure. And I think there was a point where he actually did some bass playing for the Melvins when Laurie couldn't tour due to health reasons. And so I had to think about doing this record, and I thought, you know what, there's no acrimony there. There's not really much of anything, but this will be fun to go make another record with the Melvins. It'll be interesting to do. And I'm sure it'll be a great experience on some level. So I was able to kind of put any feelings, misgivings that I had about the whole thing and just kind of adopt a pretty professional attitude. I was proud of myself for doing that, if I say so myself, and just think about looking forward to doing this. And went to San Francisco. I think they might have sent me some demos possibly of what they were going to be working on. And they had found a studio that was more or less under construction, which I had a couple of different thoughts about. It seemed like it was going to be challenging to do it. Going back to San Francisco to start working on this record was emotionally a little bit more intense than I thought. I went right back and stayed at the house that Laurie and I had lived at for the previous 5 years, and stayed in the guest bedroom. This time I was a guest in the house that I kind of have considered mine. And so that was sort of an odd experience, but I kind of threw myself into the work and things just moved along at speed. Looking back on it now, I was pretty proud of myself for behaving in a very professional manner and not being super emotional about it, and just kind of trying to rise above anything that was going on emotionally between Buzz and Laurie or Dale, and just kind of getting down to the work at hand. And I think we came up with a pretty good result from me having that attitude at the time. And thinking back on it, it would have been really easy to just go, well, I'm not going to go get involved with those people again. Of course, I would continue to get involved with those people again and again and again up until I was eventually in the band. So, and I continued on in later years with much the same attitude. But at the time, there was a record to make, and that's exactly what we did. So just on a side note, Laurie Black and I are still great friends. As a matter of fact, I spoke to Laurie yesterday for about an hour and a half on the telephone. So we are great friends, and I'm actually trying to convince her to do an interview with me, which would be a really cool thing because, of course, Laurie is like a sphinx and has not said a single sentence to anybody in about 30 years, as far as any of this stuff is concerned anyway. So fingers crossed, and I will still try to continue to convince her. So going to the studio for the first time was kind of an eye-opener. The studio was actually still under construction. The control room had not been completely finished. The sound in it was not any way a kind of a reference sound. It was not a flat listening room. I couldn't really tell what anything sounded like whatsoever in there. And my attempts to duplicate what I was hearing in the room inside the so-called control room were really challenging. And just listening to the record yesterday, I can hear myself making adjustments and trying to get over some of these sound issues that were going on. I can hear a lot of the room sound in the drum kit, and I can't tell if it's the test pressing or not that I have, but it sounds like the top end is all screwy on it. Once again, this is a test pressing that I have. This one right here, which was actually given to me by Lori and actually has some of Buzz's writing of the songs on it. This one does not have the song Candio on it, the Cars song, which the band covered on this record. So I don't know if that was reissued on further issues of this record, but maybe somebody can clue me in on that. Anyway, the sound is very strange on the record to me, and the drums almost sound like drum machine EQ'd drums. But the material on the record is very challenging. Most of the songs are under 3 minutes, which puts them right into pop song territory. However, they are definitely not pop songs. I know that this album is a very beloved album amongst fans, and it's also the first album that Lori ended up playing on. And for some reason, she didn't have her amp. I don't know what happened to her amp. She had a Mesa Boogie 400 bass amp. I think the very first one that Mesa Boogie made. And she was using that one in Clown Alley. But for some reason, that amp had gone missing or whatever. So we also had the additional challenge of her using an amp that she was not familiar with and that I was not familiar with, which was an SVT that was borrowed from somebody. It's so long ago now, I don't remember. But I do remember that there were no isolation rooms in this studio. It was a big kind of warehouse, and the control room had been built kind of in a corner of it or against a back wall or something. So everything was in the same room. There was lots of bleed. It was kind of difficult to control the sound in there. About the only thing that sounds really consistent on it to me is the guitars. And I don't think the guitars were necessarily played at a super hot volume, which typically is how Buzz liked to play in the studio. So I'm pretty sure there were probably a lot of blankets draped over the speakers. They have virtually no kind of resonance or room sounds to them. It's a very flat, straight ahead sound, but it really drives the record, and it's a great guitar tone on there. It's probably Buzz's beta lead preamps or maybe beta lead amps, along with the weird cabs that he has that were covered in shag carpeting, I think. These were probably the same cabs that he used throughout all the early years with the band, along with the beta amps, beta Sun amps. So that was the tone, and it's stayed his tone pretty much throughout the years. The bass sound is a weird kind of twangy bass sound to me, and I think that was Lori's Ibanez bean bass, as they used to call it. Lori and I bought this bass together in Palo Alto in 1983. I remember going to the store to buy it with her. And one of the reasons she loved this bass is because it had a full-size neck on it, but the body was really small, just about this big. And so that was manageable for her to play because she is about 4'11" and weighed about 95 pounds at the time. Lori is definitely the godmother of sludge and doom, and if anybody thinks that there is a bass player of her caliber playing that type of music that comes before her, please let me know. But Lori is absolutely a pioneer of heavy music for women, and she will be the first person to deny that, which is kind of an interesting thing because she's got all these other people that she looks up to from the past also. So drop a note if you know of a heavier woman bass player from that era. So we're talking about the mid-1980s at this point, late 1980s, I guess. On an additional side note, what some people may not know is that I actually taught Lori how to play the bass. And Lori first started playing the bass maybe in about 1981 when we lived in Los Angeles. Her very first bass was a Fender Mustang bass, and it was a white one. I think I still have a picture of her someplace playing this bass somewhere. I'll have to try and dig it out and maybe share it eventually. But Lori already played piano, so she was very musically inclined and had been playing piano since she was about 5 years old, and had standard piano lessons that a lot of little girls have. And she took the piano very seriously. And by the time I met her, she could actually sit at the piano and play songs by Eric Satie. And so that was a super cool thing. Most people probably don't know about that. But Lori was a pretty schooled up musician by the time she took up bass playing. One of the things that inspired her about playing bass was the band Talking Heads, because of course Talking Heads had a girl bass player also, Tina Weymouth, who's a great bass player. And so Lori and I had seen Talking Heads a couple of times in the early 80s, and that was definitely inspiring to her and probably contributed to her wanting to play bass also. The actual recording lasted maybe 2 or 3 days tops. The Melvins were very rehearsed. They'd worked on this material a lot. And when they came in, we'd record 2 or 3 versions of a song and just go through them pretty much as fast as we could. I think maybe we spent a day getting tones and then a couple of days actually tracking. The sound kind of shifts around, as I mentioned before, because I'm constantly making adjustments in there, trying to make the thing sound as good as possible. I just couldn't quite reconcile the differences between the actual sound of the drum kit in the room and the way it was sounding in the control room. So I feel like that's somewhat of a failure on my part as far as this entire record is concerned. However, Ozma does have its own unique sound within the Melvins canon, and I've even read some older reviews where people love the drum sound on this record, and they even say it just sounds like the drums are exploding or they sound like gunshots or something. So I can see where some of those ideas come from, because when I was listening to it, I was thinking it does kind of sound like fireworks going off sometime. So it's not entirely unsuccessful as far as some people are concerned, but as the producer, of course, it's rare that you're going to get exactly what's in your mind onto the tape or onto the hard drive as it is now. So the tracking was done. All of the performances, I feel, are good performances. And it has a certain energy to it that's very sort of visceral. The songs are short, but extremely powerful and atmospheric, some of the longer, moodier ones. The lyrics are typically abstract, surreal, Buzz Osborne lyrics. They're really cool. And the record was mixed at Starlight, I believe, in Richmond, which was where the Gluey Porch Treatments record was mixed also. And I think Carl Herlofson mixed this record also. The mix was a fun mix, and to do it in Starlight made me realize that it wasn't quite as terrible sounding as I thought it was going to be. But I wasn't there for the mastering, so the mastering is a big question. And as I mentioned before, I'm not sure about this test pressing, if anything was manufactured from this actual cut or if there was completely a different cut made. I believe that it's been reissued a few times. Maybe people have done some comparisons between the original cut, or maybe somebody out there has a test pressing. I don't really know. And also I'm feeling that perhaps this record was mixed to early digital, meaning mixed to like a PCM format on a Betamax tape even. So once again, there might be people out there that are familiar with what's going on. maybe people who were involved in the mastering of subsequent releases or something like that. I'm not really sure because I was out of the loop at the time. Anyway, to just recap on all of this, Ozma was kind of an interesting emotional test for me to come out and see if I was even going to be able to work with the Melvins again and just kind of keep a level head, which I did, which we all did, and we managed to make the record Ozma. And not only did we make the record Ozma, which is a cool record, as a lot of you know, but later on I would even do front of house sound for the Melvins. Lori's health precluded her going on any kind of touring shortly after that, and I think at that point Joe Preston came into the band and they did Lysol with Joe. They also did a few tours with Joe, one of which I was front of house sound man on in the United States. And then later they did a tour after they did Bullhead, I think. And they played at Reading Festival, did a European tour, and once again I was front of house sound man for that. So these were a little bit later in the 90s, like 1992. And then of course finally they asked me to join the band, which I did in 1993. So it was actually a very interesting period with the Melvins in between 1988 and 1993 when I did actually join the band, and involved me doing sound man with them, once again stepping into a completely different role with them and touring with them in those circumstances and all the stuff that that entailed, which I may or may not talk about at some point in the future. So thanks for listening to this mini explanation of what happened during the recording of Ozma. I hope some of you find it fascinating and interesting. And remember that you can buy me a coffee. You can also check out my Patreon page. And please remember to subscribe to this YouTube channel. It doesn't cost anything and it helps the channel grow. So thanks for listening and watching, and I'll see you again.